One day in March 1950, a group of policemen came to the door of the Rishengchang Bank on West Street in Pingyang. They took inventory of the property there. The first private bank in China was on the edge of bankruptcy. But curiously, just 10 years ago, Rishengchang's business was very prosperous. The amount of remittance of every branch was more than 2 million taels of silver. In the dividends period of every fourth year, the dividends for each share was as high as 10,000 taels of silver. So how had Rishengchang dropped from its most profitable period to the edge of bankruptcy in just 10 years? Since 1823, when Rishengchang opened, private banks had been in existence for nearly 100 years. Though there had been countless turbulent times, they were weathered thanks to the intelligence of Shanxi's merchants. This unique private financial institution used to be so glorious. Why did it decline steeply at the beginning of the 20th century? In the spring of 1908, in this bank office in Beijing, a man named Li Hongling was writing a letter to the headquarters in Pingyao. Such a short letter took him a long time, because he knew that the letter he was writing may determine the fate of the entire private banking industry. Several days before, in the Shanxi Chamber of Commerce in Beijing, all the bank managers from Shanxi gathered together. They were faced with a newly published regulation. They knew that if this regulation was put into practice, the operating system that the Shanxi banks had relied on for so many years would come to an end. The publication was called the Qing Bank Regulations.
Qing 银行的法律就是互补银行这个条例，后来成为Qing 银行。它在很大程度上学习引进了西方的一些经验，和中国传统的一些金融机构的规章制度有很大的区别。
According to the new regulation, not only must all the private banks be registered, but also publish financial statements to allow open and transparent supervision. The managers of the Beijing branches knew very well that the publication of financial statements would definitely not win support from the chief managers and the owners, because from the beginning of their existence, the financial statement of each branch was a well-kept secret.
票号的账簿涉及到社会上很多人的资金往来的情况。如果是这个账簿公开的话，就可能造成了他所有的客户的经济活动，让社会人都知道，这样的话是很不利的。只能把这些账簿公开，那么他的客户，不管是政府的、私人的、官员的，都不会来做了。所以他必须为客户保密，直到今天仍然有这规矩。
As the managers engaged in heated discussions, Li Hongling, the manager of a Weifang Ho branch, made a proposal. He suggested that all private banks should invest in and establish a national commercial bank together. Li Hongling had worked in Wei & Associates since 1868 and was trusted implicitly by the owner and chief manager. At different times, he had been the manager at several important branches, including Beijing, Hangzhou, and Shanghai. During his tenure of more than 40 years, he had witnessed the rise and fall of private banks, so clearly he understood the crisis that lay ahead. Conflict between the new regulation and tradition was unavoidable. Private banks could only survive by adopting a new methodology.
他见识到了好多票号的倒闭，好多票号的危机，那么见识到了银行的强大，所有票号的资本规模不如一个银行大，对吧？银行的规模大了，它就能高息息款吧，就能低息贷款，一旦发生危机，它抵制危机的能力强。
The suggestion of establishing a commercial bank won the approval of most of the attending managers. They therefore wrote proposals to their headquarters in the name of all Beijing branches. In the proposal, they suggested the establishment of a commercial bank with a shareholding system called Shanxi Banking Corporation, with all private banks making an investment. The total investment was 5 million taels of silver. As for the manager of the new bank, they proposed a wealthy merchant, Chu Benqiao, who had become famous after leading the campaign for mining protection in Shanxi. Though his suggestion won support from the branch managers, Li was not sure if his suggestion would also win attention from the chief managers in the old towns of Shanxi. After finishing this letter, Li selected 13 postcards of Beijing scenery and sent them back to Pingyao. Suggesting the chief managers in Shanxi take a little trip.
他劝总经理，他劝台东都要出国走一走，都要到外地走一走，培养天下的观点啊。在政商人物当中有这样观点的是非常小的啊，就是说他的思想跟洋务派是连在一起的。说作为一个商人啊，你没有大势观点，你不跟政府保持一致是很难的。政府都走现代化了，你不走能行吗？啊？那么这是李鸿章这个很伟大的地方，他的观点视野很开阔。
As early as 1898, in a morning council, the founder of the Imperial Bank of China, a minister named Shang Xuanhui, presented a memorial to the emperor, suggesting he let the bank take charge of the remittance of government pay. It means modern banks, the rising financial institution in China, had become a strong competitor of traditional Shanxi private operations.
银行形式组织呢，它经营范围也比较更加广泛，这个方式呢就更加规范，更加适合所谓近代市场经济发展的需要，确实对这个原有票号产生了一定的冲击吧。
In 1906, the total amount of money remitted in private banks was 22 million taels of silver. The figure gradually declined to a mere 5 million taels in 1911, almost 75% lower. Because of the shrinkage in the remittance of government pay, the business range of private banks became narrower and narrower. the same time, foreign banks in China were competing with Chinese private banks for domestic remittance business, which was a big threat to the private banks. The amount of money remitted between Tianjin and Shanghai for the cotton yarn trade was a total of 10 million taels of silver, of which foreign banks took 50%, domestic banking institutions took 30%, and private banks took only 20%. Foreign invested banks, modern banks, and traditional Shanxi private banks started to compete in the turbulent period of the late Qing Dynasty. The traditional private banks, under pressure from both the Qing government and foreign banks, gradually fell behind. But owners of the banks who lived in the deep courtyards of Shanxi were still lost in their old prosperous dreams. At the end of 1908, though New Year was coming, Pingyou, the important commercial town of Shanxi, was experiencing a solemn atmosphere. Not long before, Empress Dowager Cixi and Emperor Guangxu, the two highest rulers of the Qing dynasty, passed away one after the other, which made the owners and managers of private banks feel unprecedentedly restless. At the headquarters of the Rishengchang Bank in Pingyou, shopkeeper Jiang Xingbang was seriously ill, yet he still struggled to run his business. Confronted with hard competition, he realized that only a shrewd and capable shopkeeper could save Rishengchang from its fate. Therefore, before his death, he was hoping the trustworthy deputy shopkeeper Liang Huiwen could take over as manager. Liang Huiwen used to be the manager of a Beijing branch. During more than 10 hard-working years in Beijing, he strengthened and expanded the business of Rishengchang, enjoying a high reputation in the business world. In 1908, at the suggestion of Jiang, Liang was recalled to the Pingyou headquarters to be made vice manager. He was responsible for the supervision of all Rishengchang operations and became very busy traveling between all the branches. He enjoyed great fame and was nicknamed Old Manager Touring the Frontier. By now, the founder of Rishengchang, the Li family in Pingyou, had passed their property onto brothers Li Wufeng and Li Wudian. But they were not hardworking and diligent and spent their money in a careless and obvious way, relying on their munificent fortunes. It was said that the Li brothers often went to headquarters between 3 and 5 a.m. with a lavish team of chariots. Their special chariots were made of expensive sandalwood, and the spokes of their wheels were covered with gold-plated copper sheet. While at the headquarters in Pingyou, kitchen was ready to serve around the clock. Bird's nest and shark's fins were always available for owners and managers. The Li brothers used their bank as their own to fund their luxurious lifestyle. If they needed money, they would withdraw it directly. Deputy shopkeeper Liang did his best to persuade them not to do this.
李五典这东家啊，年纪很轻，当家以后呢，活一活浪费，随意从票号提取款项。按票号的规矩，东家不可以在票号失苏，也不能向票号借钱，更不能随意抽走资本。但是这位 李武典呢，他要这样做，遭到了梁怀文的拒绝，说这样不合适，外爷却说不能这样做，这样李武典就对他非常之记恨。
As for the suggestion made by shopkeeper Zhang before his death, though the owner Li Wudian made all kinds of promises, soon after Zhang's death, he appointed a man called Guo Shubin as the shopkeeper instead of Liang. Guo Shubin knew little about management, and his only advantage was his obedience to the owners. Having no choice, Deputy Shopkeeper Liang resigned and went back to his hometown. Rishengchang owner Li Wudian was not the only wealthy young man addicted to a luxurious lifestyle. In fact, the third and fourth generations of most Shanxi merchants also lived extravagant and dissipated lives. So the owners of the private banks gave the decision-making power to their shopkeepers.
镇商的特点是两权分离，经营由总经理负责。台东怎么办？台东就是在家里玩儿，是吧？没事干，在家里就吃喝玩乐，是吧？你根本就不留意前方，就到分红的时间看一看，好了也不管，不好了，是吧？批评两句，是吧？他不懂。
Would the owners living in Shanxi realize the crisis that lay behind their prosperity and support the suggestion of forming a new bank? The letter Li Hongling had written soon arrived at Pingyao. By then, Mao Honghan, a descendant of Mao, the founder of Wei & Associates, was the shopkeeper of Wei Taoho. However, in contrast to his ancestors' ambition of expansion, this man, who was in charge of the biggest private bank in Pingyao, only wanted to safeguard the managing power of his own business. Mao believed that the efforts made by Li were intended to deprive him of power, so that Li could be the leader of the private banking business in Shanxi. He secretly decided that he must destroy Li's scheme. Another reason for Mao's opposition to Li was his suggestion of naming Chu as the manager of the newly founded bank.
我几家要联合，联合就有个联合成本包含谁做总经理等等等等，这都产生了。但是假如说他感受到了危机，明天就要死亡了，谁做都不重要吧，让个有能力的做。可是等你不感觉到灾难的时间，总是想到自己的利益吧，想到眼前的利益吧。
In fact, as the owner of a large bank in Shanxi, the Chu family not only had some conflict with Mao and his other branches, but also did not get along well with another big family, the Qiao family.
乔家的女儿嫁给了屈元贞，屈元贞这个人呢，一方面性格比较怪。决断力强，有点独裁。另一方面呢，现在的话就比较风流，喜欢好漂亮姑娘， 那外面漂亮姑娘倒多了，他也有这个钱，那老婆是不是不满意啊？不满意就要批评他，批评他对这老婆也不满啊，对老婆不满意，对老婆生的孩子往往也不满意啊。最后老婆带着孩子回娘家了，事实上的分居嘛，是吧？这个也构成了他们之间的矛盾。
After having received the proposal, the shopkeeper of Rishengchang claimed that too many people were involved and they were not unified, so it would be hard to reach the goal. In the owners' minds, it was possible to do business together, but not possible to be owners together. Li Hongli finally received Mao's oral message in Beijing. Mao said that he had heard it was Li who had brought up the idea of founding a new bank, but that it was not necessary for him to continue. Li, who was quite clear about the situation, wasn't disappointed by the setback. He had a feeling that his proposal could not be delayed any longer. On January 14, 1909, Li and his supporters wrote letters in the name of all the private bank branches in Beijing to branches in other places and launched a large-scale exercise to solicit public views. Soon afterwards, branches in Shenyang, Guangzhou, and other cities responded to Li's appeal and wrote letters to their headquarters. Most branches claimed that they were facing a severe situation, so it would be better to form a big modern bank together to resist competitors. This brought Li new hope. But Li's boss, Mao Honghan, the shopkeeper of Wei & Associates, became irritated when he received the letters. He told the employees that Li's proposal was intended to make money for himself. So if there were more letters being written, they should be put away. Then Mao, the most powerful private banker in Pingyao, burned all of Li's letters.
这些掌握更高层的、更高权力的这些票号的这些所谓实权人物呢，当时他们认为票号发展的很好，不需要改革，对这个繁荣背后产生的这个隐藏的这种危机啊，认识不像李鸿林他们那么清楚，所以他们就是压制这个改革的呼声吧。
When pressed about the idea of reforming the industry, other owners and managers were on the same side as Mao. They thought that if their banks were transformed into a jointly invested bank, they would lose the absolute control. Their flakiness and lack of vision led to the failure of the reform. This is how private banks lost their last chance for a revival. Through their passive stance, they played a tragic role during the turbulent years around the turn of the century. This is a rubber stock from the collection of the China Stock Museum. In 1910, people held stocks like this on the Shanghai Stock Exchange and watched helplessly as the share price nosedived. At the instigation of foreign banks, a number of Shanghai merchants borrowed money from private banks to buy large numbers of rubber stocks. But then the share price slumped and the stocks became worthless. Two of Shanghai's most successful private banks, Yuan Fangrun and Yi Shan Yuan, went bankrupt. As these two Shanghai financial tycoons closed down, there was panic in major cities throughout the nation. Local capital financial institutions were all on the edge of bankruptcy in these regions. But following this huge financial crisis, and out of everyone's expectation, an even more destructive political crisis was coming. On October 10, 1911, the new army revolted in Wuchang, Hubei province. 13 other provinces and the city of Shanghai responded. In this revolution aimed at overthrowing the monarchy, the already weak private banks received a final heavy blow.
在这个革命军起来那个反抗那个清政府统治的时候，革命军他财政上也需要那个有资金啊，所以他就出现了冲击那个地方政府的那个金库，有的时候呢就冲击了票号的分号，啊，票号在辛亥革命当中，据有的票号他们自己估算有一半财产。
In the midst of the chaos of war, many bank branches were robbed, resulting in heavy financial losses. As for Rishengchang, its branches in Sichuan and Shanxi lost as much as 300,000 taels of silver. But the complete collapse of the Qing dynasty was an even heavier blow. After 100 years of operation, these private financial institutions had developed a mutually dependent relationship with the dignitaries of the Qing dynasty. This is a loan certificate issued by the financial department of the Qing government to one of the private banks in 1909. By December 1911, the financial department owed more than 7 million taels of silver to the bank branches in Beijing. Taking into account local government loans and the private loans of officials, all of the private banks were in a highly overdrawn state.
Piaohao 本来是随着商业的财商发展而发展。但是后期，它的业务重心由商业金融转向了政府金融，在一定程度上，这是一种功能的异化。随着政府的垮台，辛亥革命以后呢，票号垮台了。这是一个票号业务的功能的异化所表现出来的。
After the Qing dynasty collapsed, there was no one to pay back the government loans to the private banks. The large number of local government loans and private loans to royals and ministers were not paid back either. During the political chaos, Mongolia declared independence. Shanxi merchants were completely frozen out of the markets in large areas of northern China. More seriously, their capital in this area almost crumbled to dust.
在外蒙古地区的山西商号损失惨重，因为当时实行公有制，这些财产全部没收充公。山西商人的业务重心在北方，蒙古地区资产很多，这一次损失惨重。大盛奎一家损失的数字相当多，大概有几亿只羊，还有几万匹马的这么多财产没有能够收回。
During the big changes, many of the Shanxi merchants, including the Changs, the Qiaos, and the Caos, whose trade focus was on the Sino-Russia tea trade and tourism, and Da Sheng Kui's Bao Po branch, began to decline. As the branches in foreign countries closed down, much of these families' capital suffered irreparable decline. The sharp reduction in wealth affected the very survival of private banks. By now, the hand of fate had taken the private banks by the throat. A financial industry deep in crisis needed a strong mechanism of supervision and auditing to reduce the losses and risks. But unfortunately, such a mechanism was never put in place.
当他出问题的时候，东家也不得不把全部资产拿来进行赔偿，所以有些票号呢损失的很惨烈。还有就是两权分立过于彻底，东家对后事不能管，全凭大掌柜的德和能，缺少一个监督机制和民主决策机制，就是说没有董事会，没有监事会，这一切都是票号后来衰败的主要原因。
In those days when the crises were most serious, the managers finally realized that merging and restructuring might be their only way to survive. This contract is in the collection of the Shanxi Businessmen Museum. More than 10 of the most famous private banks in Shanxi signed the contract to form a Shanxi local bank as a limited company. The contract was signed in 1911, at a time when private banks had been looking for any way to stem their decline. In October 1913, 14 private banks from Shanxi presented a joint proposal to the government to let them form a united bank.
其实这一家银行呢，和当初李鸿林建议设计的那个银行是不大一样的。当时呢，李鸿林设计的是让各家票号的东家出一定的资本金，联合组成一个合资的股份银行。而后来实际做的这个呢，是把后来的票号没有完全彻底垮了的集中起来，共同联合办成一个联合性的银行。 但是实际上资历已经耗尽了。
The managers of private banks hoped the government could offer loans or invest directly. Compared to the Bank of the Ministry of Finance established by the Qing government, the private banks were clearly in a more disadvantageous situation. Even so, the newly founded central government of the Republic was busy enough dealing with its own affairs. In that year, a series of events happened in the Chinese political world. In March, Song Jiaoren, a leader of the Nationalist Party, was killed. In July, anti-yuan Shikai protests took place in several provinces. In September, the protests were suppressed. In October, Yuan Shikai took office as the President of the Republic of China. The messy situation and hard financial conditions left the already troubled central government with no time to consider the requests made by private bankers, and they were refused at the end. At this critical moment, owners living deep in their courtyards stopped their investment in the private banks. Perhaps they had lost hope and preferred to use their money to continue their lavish lifestyle. Private banks were deeply in debt with a large number of non-performing loans and couldn't be reorganized. By now, private banks had become like deserted orphans, having no choice but to steer their own course through the violent financial storm. In 1914, while many private banks were still struggling after the heavy blow of the Revolution of 1911, another bank, which had a close relationship with Rishengchang, suffered a crisis. A year before Liang, the deputy shopkeeper of Rishengchang, quit office. Dong Shenghe, an oil-pressing manufacturer established in Liaoning by a Guangdong merchant, suddenly declared bankruptcy. It owed foreign invested banks, the Bank of the Ministry of Finance, and various private banks a total of more than 4 million taels of silver. Among this was the money owed to the He Shang Yuan, more than 2 million taels of silver. The foreign invested banks and the Bank of the Ministry of Revenue were not too surprised to see the enterprise close down, because they offered mortgage loans, so the debt was paid back by auctioning mortgage assets. But its other big creditor, the first private bank to set up a branch abroad, He Shang Yuan, didn't even recover half the debt. Private banks in Shanxi had always offered unsecured loans, and even during periods of chaos, they trusted the merchants' creditworthiness and never asked for mortgaged or secured loans. Though it was very convenient for the clients, once crisis occurred, the blow could be fatal. When He Shang Yuan sought help from Rishengchang, the manager of the Beijing branch guaranteed it, helped to finance it, and spared no effort in saving it from the crisis. But at that time, the whole private banking industry was in a monetary contraction, and no one had extra money. He Shang Yuan went broke. Its creditors tracked down its guarantor, Rishengchang, and asked its manager to pay back the debt. In March 1915, Li Wudian, a Rishengchang owner, was caught, and all the property was confiscated. Shopkeeper Guo Shubing absconded to avoid punishment. The reputation of Rishengchang was badly influenced, and its branches were closed down one after another due to bank runs. This century-old bank was on the edge of total bankruptcy. But just then, Liang appeared back at Rishengchang once again.
这时候呢，不得不再一次把梁怀王请出来。梁怀王也在这时候觉得自己有义务来处理这个别人处理不了的事儿，再一次到了北京，处理北京放号的事儿。
Liang was nearly 60 by this time. In spite of his weak health and the rigors of a long trip, he and some partners still traveled to Beijing to clear up the accounts.
当时呢，他在北京召集所有的债权人，跟人家商量，要给政府写了自己的保证清理，不让各家债权人受到损失。经过几年诊断以后，还清了所有的债务，清理了债权。
Through Liang's efforts, Rishengchang avoided the fate of closure. It stayed in business in order to pay back its debts under the supervision of creditors. The work went on for 8 years, from 1915 to 1923. But even as Rishengchang was struggling between life and death, misfortune fell on other private banks. In 1921, as Wei Fengho closed down, Wei and Associates completely disappeared. The great fortune of the whole family vanished too. In the end, the owner died of cold and hunger. The descendants of Mao Honghui had to sell all their property and left for other places. The rich merchant, Chu Benqiao, and his family continued in business up until 1935. But after Chu Benqiao and his father, Chu Yuanzhen, passed away, their bank declined. Among all the owners of private banks in Shanxi, only the Qiao family held on until the 1930s. Then, in 1937, their Da De Tong Bank closed down. The Qiao family moved out of Shanxi, and their family business was fading. In 1923, Rishengchang opened up again. The creditors agreed that they would invest with creditors' rights and would preserve their brand name, Rishengchang. Liang was the chief manager and struggled to stay in business. But the scale of Rishengchang was greatly reduced with branches only in Beijing and Tianjin. The Rishengchang Bank has changed its name on this report to Rishengchang Money Shop. It records that in 1932, Rishengchang began to run as a money shop business. And by now, 75-year-old Liang had returned home after spending 60 years in private banking business. It wasn't until it changed ownership in 1953 that Rishengchang, which had been struggling for more than 100 years, closed down completely. It was the first private bank in China and was the last one to close down. Just like that, after being in business for 1.5 centuries, the Chinese private banking system came to an end. But the tenacious folk wisdom it was based on hadn't quite run its course. This is the city of Yuzhe in Shanxi province. In the winter of 1948, a special training class opened here. The students were all young. They had one thing in common. They had all worked in private banks or money shops in Shanxi. That same year, the People's Government posted an announcement in the north of China, stating that the People's Bank of China had been established in Shijiazhuang, Hebei province. The newly founded bank opened a training class in Yuzhe, Shanxi, in order to successfully carry out business on a nationwide scale in the following year when it moved to Beijing. The bank recruited young men with a financial background. So many apprentices from former private banks were absorbed into the People's Bank of China. Young men from the Taihang Mountains became the main force in the construction of new China's financial system. After the revolution of 1911, Li Hongling left Beijing and returned to his hometown in Pingyao. He made a living running a general store. In the year before his death, he combined his commercial letters covering dozens of years into 2 books, which clearly recorded the ideas, plans, and process of the reform of the private banking system. He left very important first-hand material, allowing later generations to study the history of Chinese private banks.
山西票号的金融文化的核心是金融伦理和为人处事的哲学。其伦理呢，核心是诚信义利；处事哲学就是中和之道。当代金融业应当弘扬晋商当年的一些传统，吸收票号一些好的东西，同时呢，也要不断的学习西方的一些好的先进经验。 这样才能保证我们的金融制度迅速的发展。
For tourists of the 21st century, the town of Pingyao is like a museum recording people and memorable events. In a period of nearly 1.5 centuries, private bankers here controlled the vein of financial development in China. They have left a vital and valuable financial culture. Nowadays, such old financial institutions merged its spirit into the financial system in modern China. Its life will pass on in this wonderful